You reached into your pocket and it was there, a wooden disc the size of your palm, smooth and cool, with a string looped around your middle finger and wound tight around the axle. You held it in front of you and threw it down, and the string unwound and the disc spun at the bottom and hung there alive, buzzing, waiting for you to tell it what to do next. You were 9 years old and you had just learned the most important thing a toy could teach you. If you let something go at exactly the right moment, it comes back. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. The Duncan yo-yo arrived in your life the way the best things always did, without warning. Maybe it was in a birthday package wrapped in newspaper. Maybe your father brought one home from the drugstore on a Tuesday for no reason at all. Maybe you bought it yourself with money you earned mowing lawns, walked it home in a paper bag, and sat on the porch step turning it over in your hands before you even tried to throw it. It did not matter how it arrived. What mattered was the weight of it. The satisfying heaviness of turned maple in your palm, the groove around the center where the string sat, the smell of the wood, faintly sweet like the inside of a toolbox. And the moment you threw it down for the first time and it wobbled sideways and hit the ground and rolled under the car, and you chased it and wiped it off on your shirt and tried again and again and again until it finally dropped clean and spun at the bottom of the string the way it was supposed to. That first clean throw changed everything, because from that moment on, the yo-yo lived in your pocket and your pocket was never empty again. The tricks came in a hierarchy that every kid on the block understood without being told. You started with the sleeper, which was just making the yo-yo spin at the bottom of the string without coming back. If you could hold a sleeper for 10 seconds, you were in the game. Then came walk the dog, where you let the spinning yo-yo touch the ground and it rolled forward on its own like a tiny wheel, and every kid watching made the same face because it looked like magic. Then rock the baby, where you made a triangle with the string using both hands and swung the yo-yo back and forth inside it like a cradle, and that one separated the beginners from the serious players. Then around the world, where you threw the yo-yo out in front of you and swung it in a full circle over your head and caught it coming back down. And if you could do that one without hitting yourself in the face or wrapping the string around a tree branch, you were somebody. Every trick had a name, and every name meant something. Skin the cat, flying saucer, Braintwister, elevator, three-leaf clover. Each one was harder than the last, and each one earned you a different kind of respect on the playground. The kid who could do around the world owned the recess. The kid who could do the Braintwister owned the block. And the kid who could land a double or nothing, 2 loops of string caught perfectly on both hands with the yo-yo balanced in the center, that kid was untouchable. You practiced in your bedroom with the door closed. You practiced on the sidewalk until your mother called you in for dinner. You practiced in the dark by feel, because you knew that if you could land the trick without seeing the string, you could land it anywhere. The yo-yo was not a toy you played with. It was a skill you developed, and the difference between those two things was everything. Then one day a man walked into your school gymnasium and the principal introduced him, and he was holding a yo-yo and he was about to change your life. He was the Duncan yo-yo man. Every school had one. He arrived without fanfare, usually on a Wednesday afternoon, and he stood in the center of the gym floor in front of 300 kids sitting cross-legged on the hardwood, and he did things with a yo-yo that you did not believe were physically possible. He threw it down and it slept for 30 seconds. He walked the dog across the entire gym floor. He did rock the baby so fast the triangle blurred. He did around the world and caught it behind his back. He did tricks that had no names, tricks you had never seen, tricks that made you grip the edges of your own yo-yo in your pocket so hard the wood pressed lines into your fingers. And when he was done, he told you that if you practiced every day, you could do everything he just did, and you believed him. Not because he was convincing, because you had already felt the string on your finger and you already knew what the yo-yo could do when you threw it right. After the Duncan yo-yo man left, the store on the corner sold out of yo-yos in 2 days. Every kid who did not have one wanted one. Every kid who had a cheap one wanted a Duncan, because the Duncan yo-yo man did not use a cheap one. He used the real thing, with Duncan stamped on the side in gold letters, and the difference between a Duncan and an imitation was the difference between a baseball glove and a garden glove. The Duncan slept longer, the Duncan came back cleaner, the Duncan felt right in your hand in a way that nothing else did. And the television commercial said it plainly, if it is not a Duncan, it is not a yo-yo. You knew the models by name the way other kids knew baseball lineups. The Imperial was the one you started with, the classic shape, rounded sides, good for beginners, forgiving when you threw it crooked. The Butterfly had a wider gap between the halves, making it easier to land on the string for tricks, and the serious kids carried a Butterfly because it meant they had moved past the basics. The Tournament was maple, turned on a lathe, balanced to spin longer than anything else in the display case, and if you had a Tournament, you did not let other kids borrow it because a Tournament was not a toy. A Tournament was a commitment. You bought them at the 5 and dime, or the drugstore, or the hobby shop, and they sat in a glass case behind the counter next to the pocket knives and the harmonicas, and you pointed at the one you wanted, and the man behind the counter took it out and set it on the glass, and you held it and felt the weight, and you knew before you threw it whether it was the right one. The cheap ones cost 50 cents. The good ones cost $1.50. The great ones cost $3, and $3 in 1962 was a fortune for a 9-year-old, but you paid it because you had held the cheap one and you had held the great one, and your hand knew the difference even if your wallet did not. Yo-yo season hit every spring like a fever. Nobody decided when it started, it just happened. One kid showed up at school with a yo-yo in his pocket, and by Friday, every kid on the playground had one. For 6 weeks, the sidewalks were full of boys throwing yo-yos, and the sound of them spinning was everywhere. A low hum that rose and fell as kids practiced in driveways and on porches and in the aisles of the grocery store while their mothers shopped. Then, one day, it was over. The yo-yos went back in the drawers and the baseballs came out, and nobody talked about yo-yos again until the following spring when the fever returned and the whole cycle started over. It was as reliable as the weather and as mysterious as anything else that children do together without being told. The yo-yo was invented in the Philippines, where children had carved them from wood and played with them for centuries before anyone in America had ever seen one. A young man named Pedro Flores brought it to the United States. He was 16 when he left his home in Vintar, a small town on the northern tip of the Philippines, and sailed to San Francisco with nothing but what he could carry. He worked as a bellhop at a hotel in Santa Monica, and during his lunch breaks, he played with a yo-yo he had carved himself. Hotel guests stopped to watch. They had never seen anything like it. The small wooden disc that dropped and came back, the tricks that made it look alive. Flores realized that people would buy what they could not stop watching, and in 1928 he started a company and began manufacturing yo-yos by hand in a small workshop in Los Angeles. He hired other Filipino men to demonstrate the yo-yo on street corners and in front of candy stores across California. They drew crowds wherever they went. Within a year, Flores was selling more than 100,000 yo-yos, and the wooden toy from the Philippines had become the hottest product on the West Coast. One of the people watching those demonstrations was a businessman from the Midwest named Duncan. Duncan was not an inventor. He was a marketer, and possibly the best one who ever lived. He had already taken the Good Humor ice cream bar and turned it into a national franchise. He had invented the concept of premium incentive marketing, where customers collected proofs of purchase to earn rewards. He held patents on the parking meter. And when he saw Pedro Flores spinning a yo-yo in front of a crowd of mesmerized children, he knew exactly what he was looking at. In 1930, Duncan bought out Flores for a sum estimated at more than $250,000 and immediately began building the largest yo-yo operation the world had ever seen. Duncan did something nobody in the toy industry had ever tried. He went uninvited to the mansion of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst and talked his way past a butler and into a room with the most powerful publisher in America. Duncan needed newspapers to promote his yo-yo contests. Hearst needed subscriptions. The deal they struck was simple and devastating. Duncan would hold yo-yo competitions in cities across the country, and every child who wanted to compete had to bring in 3 new newspaper subscriptions. Yo-yo sales exploded. Newspaper subscriptions exploded. Children lined up around the block for a chance to show what they could do with a wooden disc on a string. And the judges were the Duncan yo-yo men, Filipino demonstrators who traveled from town to town like missionaries of play. By 1946, Duncan moved his factory to Luck, Wisconsin, a town he chose because it was surrounded by hard maple forests, the only wood he trusted for his yo-yos. The factory produced 3,600 yo-yos per hour. The town became known as the yo-yo capital of the world. By the early 60s, Duncan had sold 45 million yo-yos in a country that had only 40 million children. There were more Duncan yo-yos in America than there were kids to play with them. The company spent heavily on television advertising. The slogan became so familiar that people said it without thinking. If it is not a Duncan, it is not a yo-yo. And that slogan was exactly what killed them. The word yo-yo had been the name of the toy in the Philippines for hundreds of years before Pedro Flores ever left Vintar. Duncan had trademarked it in 1932, claiming exclusive rights to the word, and for 3 decades he enforced that claim aggressively against every competitor who tried to use it. But in 1965, a federal court ruled that the word yo-yo was a generic term, as common as thermos or aspirin. Duncan could no longer own it. Any company could now call their spinning toy a yo-yo, and cheaper versions flooded the market overnight. Duncan had spent a fortune on advertising a name it no longer controlled, and the legal battle had drained the company of every dollar it had left. In November 1965, Donald F. Duncan Incorporated filed for bankruptcy. The company that sold more yo-yos than there were children in America was finished. The name was sold to Flambeau Plastics, a company that made plastic containers. They put the Duncan name on injection-molded plastic yo-yos that cost a fraction of what the wooden ones had cost to make. The yo-yos were lighter, they were shinier, they came in bright colors, and they did not feel right. The weight was wrong, the sound was wrong. The maple was gone and the smell was gone, and the way it sat in your hand was gone. The new ones worked. They spun and slept and came back, but they were not the same, and every kid who had held the real thing knew it the moment they picked up the replacement. The Duncan yo-yo men stopped coming to schools. The contest stopped appearing in the newspaper. The Hearst deal was long over. The factory in Luck, Wisconsin closed, and the yo-yo capital of the world went quiet. The towns that had hosted competitions every spring, with trophies in the window of the hardware store and local champions whose names were printed in the paper, went on without them. The Filipino demonstrators who had traveled from city to city, who had stood in gymnasiums and on street corners and in front of candy stores and taught a nation of children to throw a wooden disc on a string, scattered into other jobs and other lives, and their names were never recorded in any history book. The string that connected generations snapped. Fathers who had learned from the Duncan yo-yo man in 1955 had no one to teach their sons in 1975. The tricks that had been passed from hand to hand on the playground, demonstrated and practiced and perfected over weeks of spring afternoons, were not written down in any book that mattered. They lived in the fingers of boys who grew into men who forgot they had ever known how to make a wooden disc walk across the ground like a living thing. And the few who remembered, who still carried a yo-yo in the glove box of their car or the top drawer of their workbench, could not explain to their grandchildren why it mattered, because the world those grandchildren grew up in had no Duncan yo-yo man, no spring fever, no playground hierarchy of tricks, no five and dime with a glass case and a man behind the counter who knew the difference between an imperial and a tournament. Pedro Flores, the man who brought the yo-yo from the Philippines and started the craze that swept a nation, lived out his remaining years in obscurity. Donald Duncan Sr. died in 1971. His son tried to revive the business with new yo-yo companies and eventually opened a small museum he called the Yoseum. It closed shortly before his death in 2003. But the yo-yo itself never died. It could not die. Because the thing that made the Duncan yo-yo special was not the wood or the string or the gold lettering on the side. It was the feeling of throwing it down and watching it spin and knowing that you controlled something in a world where you controlled almost nothing else. You were 9 years old and you could not decide what time you went to bed or what you ate for dinner or whether your family moved to a different town. But you could make a wooden disc on a string sleep for 20 seconds and walk across the ground and swing in a circle over your head and land back in your hand exactly where it started. That was yours. Nobody gave it to you. You earned it, one throw at a time, on the sidewalk, in the bedroom, on the playground, in front of kids who were watching to see if you could do what you said you could do. And when you landed the trick, the feeling was not pride. It was something deeper than pride. It was the knowledge that your hands could do something difficult and beautiful, and that the only person responsible was you. There was a quiet that came with the yo-yo that no other toy ever gave you. You stood alone on the driveway in the late afternoon with the sun going down, and you threw it and caught it and threw it again, and the rhythm of it was as steady as breathing. You were not thinking about school or chores or the argument your parents had at dinner. You were thinking about the string and the spin and the weight of the wood and the exact moment to pull, and everything else in the world fell away. The yo-yo did not need batteries. It did not need another player. It did not need a board or a field or a screen. It needed you and a piece of string and 3 feet of air, and in that small space between your hand and the ground, you were completely in control of something for the first time in your life. That is what was lost when the Duncan Company closed. Not a toy, not a brand, not a factory in Wisconsin. What was lost was a particular kind of childhood moment that cannot be manufactured or replicated or sold on the internet. The moment where a boy stands alone with something small and simple and difficult and masters it, and knows that he mastered it, and carries that knowledge in his pocket for the rest of his life alongside the yo-yo that taught it to him. The yo-yos are still out there. In junk drawers, in cigar boxes, in the pockets of jackets that hang in the back of closets where nobody has reached in 40 years. Some of them still have the string wound tight. Some of them still have the gold lettering visible on the side. And if you picked one up today and held it in your palm, you would feel the weight of it and the smoothness of the wood and the groove where the string sits. And for 1 second, your hand would remember what your mind has tried to forget. The throw, the drop, the spin, the pause at the bottom where the yo-yo hangs and waits, and then the pull, gentle, exactly right, and the return, smooth and clean, back into your hand, back where it belongs. If you ever owned a Duncan yo-yo, tell me what trick you mastered first. Tell me if the Duncan yo-yo man ever came to your school and what he did that you still remember. Tell me if you still have it somewhere in a drawer or a box or a pocket you have not checked in decades. Tell me what model it was and what color and whether the string is still wound tight. Because the company is gone now, and the factory is gone, and the men who demonstrated on the street corners are gone. But that feeling, the one where you throw something away from you and it comes back, that never left.